So unless you had a topic, I thought of a topic that might be very interesting to you and me, and also helpful to me. So,
Okay.
and something I might be able to use, and that is like this thing I'm trying to do, the Insight Symposium, we can call it, and the different ways that people understand what this I call it collective insight work is. So I'm trying to use a term that can stand in for the different types of methodologies people have been using. So I know Terry Patton, he's got a book, he calls it Trans-Rhetorical Intersubjective Practice. Then there's circling, and there's collective presencing. That's what Ria Beck calls it. I know that GTC, Terry L. Fallon and GTC do transformative change, but I don't think they have a real specific term for the group process. A lot of people talk about developing the we space. That's another one. Years ago, this predates most of those people. They talked about the circle being. They actually hypothesized a new kind of collective entity. Talked about the circle being.
Who did that?
Um, uh, Groups in Europe. No one really does. Well, there are some people that still talk about like that, but that's not in fashion. That's more of a indigenous or magical, or kind of more of a mythical understanding. So in Andrew Cohen's Evolutionary Enlightenment, he does talk about, he doesn't call it a transpersonal field, but he almost comes close to talking about it, a new type of entity that arises, a collective entity. So that would be probably the closest to this. And so so what's interesting in this work is that the work is at the point where people are trying to make distinctions. And so I don't know if you've done a lot of that work or you're interested in that work, but maybe just kind of describe a little bit about how you understand that work, or what might be interesting about it. I know you're doing more of an individual kind of journey, but so that could be one thing we could talk about. To tell you the truth, I don't know that much about it myself, you know. So, but
Well, let's start with
yeah.
why is it interesting to you?
It's interesting to me for a couple of reasons. Number one is because people that I highly respect have talked about it in ways that are important to me. So for example, they'll say something really new is happening, but they're able to make distinctions between those versions of it that are not what they've experienced, and can tend to be confused with what is a new experience. So there's like a pre-trans kind of thing here, right? And so in there's a lot of confusion around what this new capacity for being together is. Now I have had I haven't gone to a lot of these experiences, but most of my experiences I would describe as subtle energy fields, right? So subtle energy could be like even mass consciousness is subtle energy, or, you know, and I'm not saying that these So I respect that these people can make that distinction, that we're not talking about fundamentalist Baptists having a unitive experience that is primarily a subtle energy experience. I mean, that's an interesting experience because subtle energy can transmit, and you can ride those waves, and you could have mass consciousness. And so that's not a path that interests me, and I think a lot of post-war humanists and postmodernists in the New Age thing, that's really what they're playing with,
Hmm.
and not naming it correctly.
Hmm.
So, there's a long tradition of debunking spiritual materialism, and so for me, just now when this new other thing may or be arising, it's important to me as, I don't know, some kind of investigator, or, I don't know who appointed me the lead examiner, but be what it may, it's interesting to me to look at that from a perspective of being able to make valuable distinctions.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the distinctions I think it matters is the difference between a group experience that's primed in such a way that there is alignment around a conceptual object that then gets associated with subtle energy field, and then that group becomes vulnerable to being distracted by the conceptual object. So you could have, for example, groups thinking that there is a circle being, or groups thinking that there's an authentic self, or and they
Mm-hmm.
get distracted by the conceptual object, and the
Mm-hmm.
experience is not remain as a praxis. Now, Terry Patton's new work said a lot of cool things. So he said it's a praxis, you can't objectify it, and so when I see people making those distinctions and still believing in the work, or still going forward in the work, then I get more curious. So that's just a little bit of what I would talk about. Now, I've had experiences that I would call collective insight, but they have not happened through a ritualized process in a large group.
Hmm.
So, and I know some of these experiences have taken years, 12, 14 years for some of these people to actually get to the sense that there is a different capacity. So I don't want to, over-privilege my skepticism, because I have not done the work. And
Uh-huh.
so these people that are doing the work, you were asking me this the other day, they're interested for some reason in coming together
Yeah.
to the home territory of somewhat skeptic
Right. Right.
to do the work together, which is a performance of the root theory in their practice, because there'll be different versions, perspectival versions of what exactly is going on, and an opportunity to see if that can be moved to the words get tricky, because no one's saying things move to a collective agreement, because as soon as it becomes in the experience becomes back into the terms, and you have perspectival multiplicity falls out again. So you can't capture it with some of these other terms. And then languaging that is interesting to me. So that's kind of my preamble about this.
Yeah. There's a lot of ground to cover.
But you can hear the skepticism in the way I'm careful to. I'm not a negativist, but I'm like an Iowan, you gotta show me, show me. So yeah, that's where I'm at. And I hope I didn't scare anyone away from coming to the symposium if you happen
I
to hear this.
I can't imagine how you would have. Um, I don't have that much experience with it, like, or with its, whatever they are. And so I would only be speaking from very limited experience and then conjecture and hypothetical distinctions. Uh, I don't know if that would be valuable or not.
Yeah, I think that I think it would be valuable. I think we could talk around it and use that as a little journey into what either what the obstacles are or what the potential pitfalls are. Um, I think that I was talking to someone the other day, a mutual friend of ours, and we were agreeing that some of this is typology. So if you tend to
Hmm.
be more of an individualist, then this is not necessarily going to be the way you are going to you're going to maybe experience that differently. But those are some of the distinctions that I would
Hmm.
make.
Okay, so you made a distinction earlier, which I was like very interested in. You used the word mass consciousness to describe a subtle energy field that happens in groups, and I'm wondering, and I'm not saying that there's one thing called collective insight or that, all these different leaders of group processes are tapping into the same thing or even tapping into. I don't even know what language to use yet because I think
Right, right. It's not.
there's
Yeah,
there's different ways of characterizing what's happening here and many different things might be happening. But I'm wondering why you think that what you said is mass consciousness. First of all, what's that, and why is that not what these people are doing?
right. So that would be. I'm certainly not accusing any of these people of doing that, and that's the far end of what nobody wants to be doing. But there is an experience that people in groups can have. I would call it a subtle energy experience. I mean, you walk into a funeral home and it'll hit you, right? So what is that's a transmission of subtle energy, with a sort of emotional content. And or you can be, I remember the Vancouver riots and people describing how hard it was to be on the periphery because the energy itself moves the patterns of energy in you, and so you can find yourself becoming more violent or more aggressive or more in that experience. So there's.
And and why is that not what's happening? How are you clear that that's not what's happening in these groups?
Well, I'm not clear, but
Yeah.
um,
Well, there's a kind of derogatory way of talking about that mass consciousness. You're sort of saying that they don't want to be doing that.
right, because well, I think that this is not emergent thing. I mean, subtle energy transmission is nothing new, right?
Hmm.
And so there are people that in certain places that I've experienced where you can develop a subtle energy field, and then you can prime that with an object for the conceptual mind. So this is the witch, this is your dead one coming in. You can feel it. You can feel you're changing. You can feel your heart racing. You can feel it, can't you? And you have to say yes. And then you can prime that with an object, and then you can align people around the object. So then those two things get entangled, and then forever people can chase the object, and that's easier because they'll chase the object all the way to the bank or whatever, right? So this is not extraordinary. This is, and it can be even maudlin. I mean, people go to business sales techniques to learn this. People go
Yeah.
to become NLP practitioners to learn how to
Yeah.
be better salespeople. So, no, I think it's an interesting phenomenon, and that could be interesting, but it's not what has the possibility of being something that gives us a greater capacity, evolutionary capacity, or however people, they don't usually use that term, but we can use that term. And it has as many drawbacks at this point in history as it does in, usefulness. So I think that's one kind of really primitive thing. And I'm not saying that that's not valuable. It's just not new.
Sure.
Um, so what I was pleased to see in the last couple of experiences I have is an awareness that we're not looking for some common denominator. We're looking to be unique, in as unique as we can be. And in that process, there is some kind of collective, we could call it a collective state experience. We'll just use that as a placeholder. It's called different things. And so this attention to the uniqueness, and I'll give you an example. I teach this thing with horses. So I'm going to say that there is a subtle energy aspect of it, but that subtle energy aspect is that when you're working with horses and you go through this process where you're bonded with them, and you can't see the horse is behind you, and you want the horse to stay with you. We may have talked about this the other day, but and the horse is behind you. If you think of the horse behind you, the horse will stay right there. It actually feels stuck back there because you're actually thinking of the horse behind you. But if you scan your own body for that place where you just want the horse to be with you, that feeling of wanting to be with the horse or being in relationship with the horse, and if you scan it as it arises in your body, the horse will walk along with you, because the uniqueness the unique aspect is that it comes up as you. Whereas in these other experiences, you really feel that there's something in the room or something exterior to you that is arising. And to me, that's the baiting, the objectify, the mind. The mind wants to see an object out there. And so, of course, it's a back and forth. And so the groups that emphasize that the way the transpersonal arises is in the unique expression, that to me is a new quality of this work. So that would be one quality that I would look for.
Hmm. Okay. So I have had this question about whether these experiences are new or not. On one of the, I think it was one of the Beyond Awakening calls between Terry and Thomas Hubel, either Terry or Thomas brought up, but whoever brought it up, the other one agreed, pretty sure, brought up even like soldiers marching in lockstep as an example of, and then feeling like they slip into a kind of group consciousness as an example of this kind of we space, and in the context of Thomas's work in that sense. And so I think differentiations are good because at least in terms of, there may be different kinds of experiences, but I'm not sure that that everyone working in the group spaces are making distinctions. They may want it to be new, or might want there might. So I'm not sure. I'm not so confident that it's brand new or it's old or something. What might be new is ways of getting into it, ways of paying attention to it while it's happening, and then speaking speaking to it and speaking from it, which makes it stronger, and then potentially utilizing it for a given purpose consciously within a group.
Right. So the metaphor of soldiers walking in step is what I would be against. In other words, and so why does that matter? I think it matters because there's something tricky, I call tricky, about post-war humanism. And certainly coming out of World War II, people really wanted not to be fighting each other anymore, especially Europe. And although Americans, the Anglo-Americans, came out of World War II actually quite individualistic, but in Europe and the whole humanist movement, post-war humanist movement, is primarily a continental movement. And um, so that's a kind of sentiment. This shared consciousness movement has arisen out of that. We talk about it as being green and spiral
Mm.
dynamics, and the thing is, that's nice, but paradoxically, it's the structure of consciousness that best plays into neoliberal capitalism, because because in the graphics I use is this. So the post-war humanists like to use, the peer-to-peer people like to use this illustration where, there's the big fish eating the little fish, right? Then what they do is they take all the little fish, and the little fish are aligned so they're bigger than the big fish, and then they come to eat the big fish. So I say, but there is no big fish. Who's the big fish? Capitalism. Well, who's capitalism? It's just a bunch of people who are aligned.
Huh.
There is no big fish. The big fish is a conceptual illusion, right? There's only little fishes, right? There's only people. So the alignment policy is as problematic as it has potential. And so that's a false argument. And what's happened, Roy Bhaskar talks about capitalism is only able to be maintained by the creativity of the slaves, and that's what I think has happened. So the biggest boom to post-war to neo-global capitalism is post-war humanism, and you may or may not think that's problematic, but the paradox is most post-war humanists thinks the biggest problem is capitalism. So there's some kind of strange,
Uh-huh.
be careful what you wish for here.
Uh-huh. That's funny.
So if that's the outcome, even if it's not the goal, if it's the outcome of this work, then I would say it's problematic. And it certainly would be unfortunate for someone like Terry Patton's work, because he truly wants to move this into movements that were inspired, like Occupy, into movements that will break down the structures of neoliberal capitalism and these other types of status boundaries. So I think his intention is in the right place. But the question is whether the outcome he's proposing is actually an effective, counter-terrorist attack or something. If capitalism is the terrorist here. So for me, it matters, and yeah, and in fact, But the three people I know, or the three or four people I know most well, are truly, undoubtedly not for neoliberal capitalism or that whole kind
Uh-huh.
of thing. So there's a so that's one whole arena.
Like I said, I'm speaking from conjecture. So there
Yeah.
are questions I have about these kinds of experiences that I don't really know. So, for example, like for example, with Thomas Hubel's work, he talks about now. See, I feel very uncomfortable referencing any of these people that I have such little experience with,
Right.
and
So we're
saying that I
using him as a placeholder, and we're basically talking about your understanding. We could even say, "Oh, it's our projection. We don't care. We can use him
yeah,
for
I'm
material."
just I'm curious about I'm very curious about I think it's fun. Like right now when I enter any space and that I think it's also exciting. Like there's something and that's why I don't really want to separate it so clearly yet from mass consciousness experiences. Like it's fun. So
All right. What's
I don't want
fun?
to get too up in my head. So like, okay, the first thing that is fun to do, I think there's lots of it. Okay, I think that there's lots of reasons why collective. I'm gonna call it collective consciousness as
All
a
right.
whole,
Okay.
generally, right now,
Cool.
in in the kind of spiritual circles that I know of, and you know more of, this all these sorts of people doing this kind of collective work. I think there's multiple reasons why it's interesting, but one basic reason is because it's fun. You get together with a group of people, you get to like and something very cool happens
Yeah.
between you, and there's a sense of mystery. And I think energy is very, very central to it because it feels good. It can feel juicy.
Yeah.
It can feel kind of like you're walking down a pathway and like you're exploring a landscape that you've never known before. You can actually feel like synchronicities become very, very prominent in this space and not just, and then it'll feel like not just like even like I've had experiences in a group where synchronicities don't just feel in the members of the group, but they also feel like they're happening with the group from external objects at the same time. And communication becomes really subtle, so it becomes like, and if you're paying attention to it, it can be a kind of very neat confirmation of psychic communication or
Right.
sublingual communication. So, and and it feels good to be part of a group, and it seems like in a lot of cases, spontaneity is a big. See, again, I don't know the methods all that well, but I know at least in some cases, spontaneity and saying yes to whatever's coming through you
Mm-hmm.
is like a big part of the method. And acting spontaneously, improv, spontaneous speech, all of these things kind of, I think, pretty sure I've heard interesting studies about how they it can change where language comes from in your brain, so
Mm-hmm.
it doesn't feel so much like I'm thinking about this sort of thing, but and so that just that experience, spontaneity, spontaneous action, and speech in general, I think feels good. So plus it feels good to be part of a group. So I have all these questions about basically what's going on here. And then the last interesting thing is that it's really exciting to sort of like see how this could be used to solve problems, basically. And that's where I'm most, that's where I think the sort of like rubber hits the road, I, I think, is right there. Is like when you're with these people, what kinds of problems can you solve better? And is it truly that you have access to information and that you wouldn't have had access to as individuals, even individuals working wonderfully together? Um, And because otherwise, I mean, the experiences are wonderful, and they can teach us about ourselves and about groups and about energies and
Hmm.
about all kinds of things. But and they're fun, so I'm not discounting them. But like, if there really is something new happening, something, like kind of like uh, like paradigm shifting or something
Hmm.
like that, then it's got to be like, yeah, there's actually new information involved
Right.
or new problems that are solved better through
Right.
this. And I haven't heard anyone flat out say, yes, we're doing something like that in a really clear way,
Yeah.
in a really impressive way also.
Okay. Hold on. Edit break. You can. The storm is coming, so it's very dark
Oh,
outside.
that's awesome. You sound like you have great weather there.
I know. Did you see how bright it was when I
Yeah.
started, and now it's like it's
Well,
changed
summer
so fast.
Summer East Coast weather. That's so cool. I miss it.
Well, because it's the transition, there.
Oh,
So now I
it's
have
fall.
artificial
Yeah,
light on.
fall.
Okay, so now you see, so I was the dour person, but this exactly where my my natural sense of this is exactly what you're saying. I was writing copy for the campaign, and I wrote something about um, insight or collective insight. It's natural, it's spontaneous, it's play, it's imaginative. These are the words that I would use for this work. You know, it it it's embodied. I think it's the collective version of, what we call flow in sports, or flow in, I don't know how to say his name, but the person who created that concept, and he uses the same words. Um, there's a lot of creativity and spontaneity in it. I like to think of it. It can get at the level where it's like high play, like the even the conceptual aspects are really moving in territories that they really haven't been before. But because there's so much intersubjective resonance, that you're following concepts into new territory without a lot of experience behind them. You don't have to have gone through a whole lot of time with someone, and you can start tracking each other in this other way. But I would not call that. It doesn't have that much to do with um, what is traditionally called awakening or anything. I mean, it reminds me more of, those videos where you see the two kids, sometimes they're twins, and they're like dancing and they're talking. And their words don't have any concrete signifiers, right? But they're tracking each other because they are together in this
Huh.
other kind of field, right? And so so for me, these are natural primitives, of human nature. And then if we can stay in that and then add the conceptual blending, then maybe the concepts can create, there'll be insights in the concepts, but to me that's more like recovering something originary and more of a process of subtracting than some kind of new evolutionary territory. So I would say bring, so that is another way that I'm more comfortable with saying that is exactly what, on rare occasion, we experience, and those of us who know how to play with people get to
Hmm.
experience that more often.
Hmm.
And so what has to be subtracted? A lot of things normally have to be subtracted. In a work situation, all the power structures have to be subtracted. You never get to that point of play, right? So there's a lot of conventional situations where teams can't really get to that point of play because of these structures, or
Hmm.
there's all kinds of obstacles that disable people from being spontaneous, creative, and playful.
Hmm.
Um, so, maybe that's all there is to it.
Right? Yeah, I don't know. I don't know. And I'm not. I think it's like an awesome track to go down. I guess. Yeah. Why? Why am I? Why do I feel skeptical? I feel skeptical, in because in some ways it feels like a fad, and I don't really. I'm not often on the forefront of fads. And so I feel resentful of what all the cool people are doing.
Yeah,
So I'm like,
I'm.
you go do it, and you tell me. But yeah, I mean, it could be a whole new way of being. It could be a whole new thing. I mean, one thing yeah, okay. So one thing is like, Thomas Hubel talks about, but I just don't. I have confusions about. Yeah, I mean, so like Thomas Hubel talks about not knowing. He talks about speaking from like or I don't know what he
Right.
uses, speaking from emergence, but
The
basically
future, right?
not knowing what you're going to say next.
Right.
And it just feels better. It just fucking feels better to interact with people from that place, even when you're just having a conversation with a friend. Like when I'm in that place, or more in that place than trying to, repeat old thoughts that I've had or something like that. It's just more fun. It's more spontaneous. It's more fun. Um, and I contrast that. So like if we were to just sit together and be like, neither of us knows where we're going to go at all. We have no topics in mind. We're just gonna just be here and speak and see what happens.
Right.
On the total other side of the spectrum, I point to like a lot of what my schooling has been like, where the teacher's standing in front of the room and there's a bunch of students over here and he knows exactly what he's going to say. And or if he goes to a conference, he knows exactly what he's going to say. He's like, there's information delivery.
Right.
And it's all,
It's
and
dead.
so it's dead. It's totally dead. And that's why I hated school, even college. I mean, that's not, but I do have a question about, and so it feels like from that spontaneous place that new things are happening. And it's not that concepts don't get weaved in,
Right.
because I've learned them. They're part of who I am. But I wouldn't have known those concepts. This is my hypothesis at the moment. I'm not sure I would have known those concepts unless I received them in a dead way from someone else or read them in a book or something. So I get a little concerned about, thinking that these collective consciousness sort of things are going to be like the huge new thing in a way that we diminish the value of these not as fun but potentially useful, clearly, other ways of communicating in which we're just delivering information, for example,
Right.
Or collecting information or whatever, So that's just another question I have, and it's boring. Like I feel like kind of like this, like I feel sort of like this boring moderate when I say something like that, but like it's like kind of like common sense kind of thing. But like it's true. It's like there's a utility. There are utilities to these different ways of communicating, and I think we should honor the utility of different ways, of all kinds of ways of communicating, if we indeed find that we need that. So, and there's more there. There's more, like a hyper emphasis on the new, kind of like generational disinterest in history, lineage, past knowledge, which I think are bad for us. So there's a lot of themes here, I think, that are at play, that make me both excited and slightly hesitant about all of this collective consciousness work.
Yeah, I mean, I think a nice attitude is to be experimental, like you said. You know, if you're experimental, it's always interesting, and and it can often be fun. Um, but so let me try to make the case for what could conceivably be useful about it. Okay, so I was talking to someone the other day, and I used this metaphor, and I said, when people usually get together as a group, and we're not talking about people who get together to only do group consciousness work. We're talking about people who come together to do things like um, work out the terms for Syria to turn over their chemicals, or people who come together to stop the bleeding of some kind of financial problem in large corporate, you know, wicked problems. So you get groups come together, and the initial phase is somewhat ruled by implicit rules, somewhat um, then and what usually happens is people or this group that I'm working with, well, let me just, this will make it more easy to describe. I'll just describe the dynamics in this group. So there's a diversity of opinions about building this network for building trust at a distance. And there's a pretty strong fault line between one person who's much more pragmatic and object-oriented, and one person who thinks that we have to get the intellectual design of it right first. You have a pragmatic person here, and you have the person who's more of a meta thinker. Now, from where I look at, they're both going to build the same thing, but the dynamics get such that there's a fault line, and then the group involved are either, you know, so then they start adding people to their team, and consciously or unconsciously it teeters and totters. Some more people get added that on this fault line, and then some people get, and so you have this polarization thing that's going to happen that won't go away, which will destroy their ability to make a system that they want to build. It will always have that fault line. So when you try to talk to people about it, what happens is they just keep downloading their information in various ways. They just try to argue their point the same way over and over and over again, and they don't make any progress. So the metaphor I use is, I like, look guys, you know, you wouldn't go to a barbecue. Let's say everybody came to a group barbecue, and you all brought your own piece of meat. So you brought chicken and you brought ribs. Said you wouldn't expect to leave the barbecue with uncooked chickens and ribs. You'd expect to cook it into something else, you know. And so when you have people who trust each other, but there's a fault line, then the only way to move is not this one move to this person's or this. You have to create something that you never thought of before. To me, that's the exciting part. Like, the exciting part is that this has gone on so long that we know that the real place we want to be is neither place. I mean, you both just dump everything you know. And to me, that's the unknowing maybe that Hubel's talking about, because we're not making any movement. Maybe it's not even progress. Maybe at this point, even going backwards is better than not making any movement. And so with that in mind, that's what I would call collective insighting. So now you've all agreed, you put it all on the table, and what you're looking at, everything that everyone can see, you agree is not what you want to see. It's not the point. It's dead, it's known, it's done with. Now, what can we cook up, right? We don't know. It doesn't exist. And so, to me, that's very fun and very playful. And when that process happens, there is a chance, and it doesn't happen often, that people, you have to get creative and crazy, and you come up with different ideas, and you talk about things that aren't possible. Then all of a sudden, some idea, wait a second, do you mean this? And maybe it's not even what you meant, but that person actually said it in a way you wished you had said it. And then all of a sudden, you don't know who said what first, and you can't really credit any one person. And a lot of times there's a lot of joy and you laugh, but something that really nobody had talked about before, never really thought of it that way before, gets generated in this process. And then I would call that collective insighting. And I think it only requires an orientation around really understanding that what you know, what you question, and what you fear, you all look at it, you all look at what all of it's brought to the table, and then you agree what we want to leave with is none of that. That's it. You guys are out of here. That's boring. That's dead. When I get back to the office, I might use it, but for this experience, get that out of here. It's no fun.
Hmm. Hmm. So the only difference I see between that kind of work, what you're describing, or it sounds like you're facilitating that with people who aren't as familiar with it, and what these other groups are doing, some of them at least, is that there's attention being placed on the field itself, on the field or on what the group is doing itself, with an awareness that this kind of field or space, again, don't have the right terms, can be created and is useful, so that you modulate how you're being with each other moment to moment, and how you're, in order to, and have attention on the space itself in order to keep growing the space, which adds an extra level of excitement to it and sense of potential.
You mean what they're doing? I think what they're doing is like really, it's more like experimental or theoretical physics. They're really looking at what are the components of, what are the qualities, textures, tastes, components, structures, obstacles when people get together. And so for my symposium, I'd like to do is so now what are just some principles that we can use to, you don't want to use it as a methodology. You don't want to prime the notion of collective consciousness or anything, right? We want to, or I would, when I use the term collective insighting, I'm not saying this is what other people are interested in, but and it may or may not lead to more or less a feeling of collective consciousness. I'm not sure. I've never tried it with. I've never been successful yet with a naive team, because
Mm.
they usually just still argue.
Yeah, that's a
Although
good
the
point.
Ellen
That's a good point.
courses, that online course, there's been quite a lot of movement toward that kind of discourse that's more generative. And I think the sense of losing track of who said what first, or who had that idea, or how the idea came. I think that's part of that feeling. You
Hmm.
don't. Yeah. So in a classroom situation, when you have a real teacher, it feels like that. You're talking to the teacher, and knowledge is being generated, but you start to lose track of who's teaching whom. It's just kind of, yeah.
Hmm. Hmm. When I Yeah. It feels, you know what it feels like? It feels like when I first started meditating, the very first experience I had of meditating, I this is the feeling of excitement and potential. And it doesn't mean this is my hesitancy with the group consciousness thing. It could be really I want to support this experimentation. But I don't think the feeling of excitement and potential guarantees anything. I think it just makes it worth it. Because like when I first started, I also had the yeah okay. At first, when I first started meditating, I had the experience of dropping into this whole inner landscape that I didn't know was there, and it was all I had was textures and shapes, and it was beautiful. It was beautiful, and eventually, the novelty of exploring new textures and shapes itself wore off. And so that kind of excitement and potential um, was no longer there really. And so then there was more of a sense of like, okay, well, it's time to get down to work, basically. Like, it's time to focus on common sense again, and eventually, you know, shadow work and integration and awakening in the context of the ordinary. And so it's neat. It's neat, but I'm not. I have no feeling of, you know, like, oh, this is the big solution to all of our problems. I'm skeptical of any time somebody says this is the big solution to all of our problems, because I often find the most authentic virtues. My experience of the most authentic virtues are that they feel grounded. Like they feel like they come from a deep place of, I'll call it deep common
Mm-hmm.
sense. Those are the people who I really see like paying attention to the details of what's going on in the world and just doing the day-to-day work, to make change happen. And those are the people that make it possible for visionaries of all sorts to do experimental work in all directions and develop new tools for us as a human race. But then it seems to come back to utilizing those tools in a way that is just like, you
Yeah.
know, step kind of like very simple, unpretentious, um, you know, grounded.
Yeah, I think that and for me it's more like the subtractive path, right? So you have to
Mm.
so if I subtract the boundary between my role as a teacher and your role as a student, then we haven't invented anything new. We've just subtracted something, you know,
Mm.
and and um, that's, you know, it's a metaphor. But I think that um, we're always doing kind of funny things as humans, you know? We're always creating prisons. We were talking about this last time, and then forgetting we created them. And then when we bust out of them, we get so proud of ourselves, you know? So, like, we create the ego, and then we spend 2,000 years creating practices that can deconstruct the ego, and then we get really proud of ourselves,
It's
right?
really funny.
But so this is a tendency that might happen with this collective version of it. So we create this structure called the we space, and then it becomes like completely, you know, now that we've got rid of the ego, we can create this thing called the we space that we all can be underneath, which is
Right.
really exciting. And then in the next phase, we can deconstruct it and be
Yeah.
liberated again into our individual selfness and uniqueness, right? So I think that's all fine if it's completely transparent because it's just creative. It's when it's not transparent that it becomes painful, I would say. I mean,
Mm.
other than that, so like, um, yeah, so I think that this is, and then the other thing is I agree with you. I think many of the things that we think are uh, newly arising phenomenon because we're humans are actually structures or types of phenomenon that we inherit from, more of our animal nature, more of just being a living, adapting organism, more of some more grounded or deeper levels. And if you start to think of experiences as striated like that, would be an interesting question as to then what is uniquely human.
Mm-hmm.
Um,
Mm-hmm.
because I agree with you. I think the the um, the groundedness, the subtle energy, um, that we're all in the same kind of subtle energy flow. You can feel that we're all porous to it and stuff that we have, we share with, all the other sentient beings. So it's not uniquely human. And in that
Mm-hmm.
sense, it's not new.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
But it's rich. And so, um, I like to tell a story about,
Hey, Bonita.
yeah.
I'll need to go in like 5 minutes.
Okay, so can we end with the story?
Yeah,
Do you ever read the story Jonathan Livingston Seagull? You're too
I
young.
did.
Oh, you
I
did?
did. I did.
See, that was a big story for me when we were growing up. Because when we were growing up in typical, um, American suburbs or rural, is, and I went to Catholic school, we didn't feel that individual, We were kids of the 50s. We felt like things were kind of the same, So you read Jonathan Livingston Seagull, and what is he? He like, I'm unique. I'm like an individual, right? And it's like it's a spiritual experience. So now, generations later, we have people going like, "We're all one," and it's a spiritual experience because it's not ordinary. It's not the usual. It's more rare, right? It's the same. It's the same thing. It's just that all of a sudden you realize the other side of the coin, and you're like, whoa, we're all one, So, and that's why for me it's like what's new. What I like to play with is being outside of those flip flop things for the rest of our human existence, getting beyond the duality of how we organize experience as one or the other. So the we thing has a little bit of that potential trap, and and yet it's still inviting.
Oh yeah.
Maybe because it's a potential trap. You got to figure that one out too.
So now maybe if people see this last part of the talk, maybe they'll be not want to come to the insighting retreat. I'm not sure.
All right.
This is great. This is a great conversation.
Okay, well, so that was helpful. You didn't. I had thought you were going to stick up more for the new consciousness movement, and then we could have had more of a fight, but didn't happen that way.